November 17, 1944, Luzon, Philippine Islands. The first written mention of the rifle appears in a personal field notebook belonging to Captain Daniel H. Mercer, U.S. Army Ordnance Corps. It isn't dramatic. It isn't even detailed. It's just a single line written in pencil, slightly smudged by humidity. Test weapon arrived today. Sound unlike anything I've heard. Men unsettled. At that point in the war, unsettling weapons were no longer unusual. By late 1944, the Pacific had become a laboratory of desperation. Every island taken revealed a new problem. Deeper bunkers, smarter fortifications, defenders who had learned how to survive bombardment and wait for infantry to come close enough to bleed. Casualty projections for future operations were quietly climbing into numbers officers avoided saying out loud. The question was no longer how to win. It was how to survive winning. Captain Mercer had been pulled from routine ordnance work 3 months earlier and reassigned to a project that technically did not exist. There was no official name, no standardized designation. Orders came verbally, sometimes written and then burned. The task was simple in theory and borderline insane in practice. Determine whether a standard-issue infantry rifle could be modified to deliver bunker-destroying firepower without turning its operator into the first casualty. The rifle chosen was the M1 Garand, not because it was ideal but because it was everywhere.
Millions in circulation.
Proven reliability. If something catastrophic happened, it could be buried easily under the fog of war. No new launcher, no new doctrine, just a familiar shape doing something unfamiliar. The breakthrough came not from redesigning the rifle, but from violating an unspoken rule. Rifle ammunition was supposed to be small, light, fast. Someone inside the project asked what would happen if that assumption was discarded entirely. What if the projectile carried its own explosive force? What if the rifle was no longer delivering kinetic energy alone, but controlled detonation? The experimental rounds that followed were closer to shells than bullets. Thick casings, heavy mass, a small explosive charge designed to detonate milliseconds after impact. They were never meant for distance. Effective range was brutally short. Accuracy beyond that didn't matter. The target would be large, immobile, hard. To fire them, the Garand had to be reinforced almost to the point of parity. Barrels thickened, receivers strengthened by hand, gas systems tuned individually. These were not factory rifles. They were handcrafted compromises, each one slightly different, each one living on borrowed time. Early test firings were conducted far from cameras and observers. The results were mixed and terrifying. Yes, the rounds worked. Against reinforced concrete, they didn't chip or crack. They punched inward and detonated, collapsing sections of bunker faces that previously laughed off grenades. But the rifle paid a price every time. Stress fractures appeared after limited use. Stocks splintered. One test report mentioned a shooter being thrown backward despite a supported firing position, his helmet cracking against the ground. Still, the pressure from above didn't ease. Every successful detonation was weighed against projected invasion casualties. In that comparison, broken rifles meant nothing. By early November, a decision was made. A limited number of modified Garands would be shipped forward for combat evaluation. Not as a standard issue, not even as a trial unit. They would be placed into the hands of select infantrymen under strict instruction. One shot, then reposition.
No heroics. No improvisation.
When the crate arrived on Luzon, Captain Mercer personally supervised its opening. Inside were 5 rifles and fewer than 60 rounds. The ammunition was packed individually, wrapped like explosives rather than bullets. Each sleeve was marked with handwritten warnings. There were no clips. Loading was manual, deliberate. The men assigned to carry the weapon noticed immediately that something was wrong. The rifle felt heavier, unbalanced. When fired during controlled testing, the sound silenced the surrounding jungle. It wasn't a crack. It wasn't a boom. It was a deep, concussive thunderclap that rolled outward, followed by a pressure wave you felt in your chest more than your ears. Mercer wrote again that night. Sound echoes longer than expected. Men flinched even when not firing. Recommend limited exposure. Combat came quickly. Against wooden structures, the weapon was pointless excess. Against caves and reinforced positions carved into hillsides, it was devastating. One shot could do what previously required a squad coordinating grenades, suppressive fire, and luck. But it was never subtle. Every discharge announced itself to everyone within hundreds of meters. Japanese troops encountering it for the first time didn't understand what they were seeing. There was no visible artillery, no incoming aircraft, just a single rifle raised, followed by thunder and destruction. Survivors carried the story forward. In intercepted notes and later recovered documents, the same phrase appeared repeatedly: Raimei no Ju, thunder rifle. Japanese officers began issuing warnings. Any sound resembling thunder without artillery fire was to be treated as a priority threat. Suspected operators were to be eliminated immediately. In some cases, counterattacks were launched solely to silence a single rifle. The weapon exacted its toll on its users as well. Recoil bruised shoulders through winter gear. The blast disoriented nearby troops. Misfires were rare, but unforgettable. One shell embedded itself into a bunker wall without detonating. For several seconds, no one moved. Everyone waited. It never exploded. That silence stayed with the men longer than the sound ever did. Back in the rear, engineers argued endlessly. Some saw proof that infantry could carry limited heavy firepower. Others called it a dead end, too dangerous, too specialized, too psychologically damaging. Mercer fell somewhere in between. His final note on the subject was short: effective, terrifying, not sure who it's worse for. By early 1945, the Thunder rifle had become more myth than weapon. Rarely seen, frequently discussed, never officially acknowledged. It didn't change the course of the war, but for a brief moment, it showed how close the line was between innovation and desperation, and how easily it could have been crossed again. December 3, 1944, Northern Luzon, Philippine Islands. By the time Captain Daniel H. Mercer received the first consolidated field reports, the Thunder rifle had already stopped being treated like an experiment and started being treated like a curse. The men who carried it didn't argue about whether it worked. They argued about whether it was worth surviving long enough to fire it again. The weapon had settled into a narrow, brutal role. It was brought forward only when everything else failed, when a bunker refused to die, when grenades bounced uselessly and flamethrowers couldn't get close enough without losing men. When the Thunder rifle came out, it meant patience had ended. Japanese defenses in northern Luzon were not crude or static. They were living systems. Bunkers were layered, connected by tunnels, reinforced with timber and stone, angled to deflect blast and shrapnel. After the first confirmed uses of the Thunder rifle, something changed. Positions that would normally return fire immediately began waiting. Silence replaced resistance. American patrols reported approaching intact fortifications that showed no sign of life until they committed men forward. Only later did Mercer understand why. Intercepted communications and battlefield behavior revealed the shift. Japanese units had learned the sound. Not just the thunderclap itself, but the short, unnatural echo that followed. They understood what it meant, and they began planning around it. Dummy bunkers were the first adaptation. From a distance, they looked convincing. Fresh earth, firing slits, sometimes even smoke to suggest occupancy. The Thunder rifle would be brought up, carefully aimed, and fired. The detonation would obliterate the structure, revealing nothing but emptiness. Seconds later, concealed positions would open fire on the exposed shooter and anyone nearby. The weapon's strength became its weakness. One shot announced itself, and the response was immediate and violent. Then came layered sacrifice. Japanese engineers deliberately manned forward decoy positions with minimal personnel, knowing they would be destroyed. Their purpose was not to hold ground, but to locate the Thunder rifle. Once identified, artillery, mortars, and snipers would converge. In at least 2 confirmed engagements, Thunder rifle operators were killed within minutes of firing, not by return fire from the target, but by indirect fire triggered by the sound. Mercer's notes from mid-December grow darker. He stopped writing about effectiveness and started writing about psychology. Men hesitate to carry it. Volunteers decreasing. Association with immediate retaliation. One rifle was quietly left behind during a repositioning, not due to damage, but because no one wanted to be the next one holding it when it fired. The weapon itself was degrading faster than anticipated. Barrels showed microfractures after limited use. Gas systems behaved unpredictably under field conditions. One rifle vented gas violently to the side, concussing a nearby soldier who wasn't even firing it. Another developed a hairline receiver crack that went unnoticed until after a round was fired, narrowly avoiding catastrophic failure. Mercer began to suspect the rifles were dying faster than the men. The most serious incident occurred on December 18th near a ridgeline overlooking a narrow valley. Intelligence reported a reinforced cave system halting progress for 2 days. Artillery support was unavailable due to weather. A Thunder rifle was brought forward. The shooter, a corporal whose name Mercer later omitted from his notes, braced and fired at close range. The round impacted, penetrated, and then failed to detonate immediately. What followed was worse than an explosion. For nearly 5 seconds, nothing happened. Then the shell detonated inside the rock, not outward. The blast vented back through the firing slit and into the open air. The corporal was thrown backward, unconscious. 2 nearby soldiers suffered severe concussive injuries. The cave partially collapsed, but not enough to neutralize it. Japanese fire resumed almost immediately. The rifle survived. The men barely did. That incident triggered serious debate. Field commanders demanded withdrawal of the weapon. Ordnance wanted more data. High command remained silent. In the end, the rifle stayed, but their use became even more restricted. Mercer was ordered to stop formal testing and simply observe. Let the weapon find its own fate, one message read. Japanese adaptations continued. Fortifications began incorporating angled stone faces designed to deflect direct impact. Some caves were deepened to absorb explosions without collapse. In several engagements, Japanese troops deliberately waited until the Thunder rifle fired before revealing machine gun positions, knowing the shooter would be momentarily disoriented and exposed. By late December, the Thunder rifle had become predictable in a way no experimental weapon should be. This presence changed behavior on both sides. American units grew cautious, sometimes to the point of paralysis. Japanese units grew patient, willing to sacrifice ground to eliminate a single rifle. Mercer realized something unsettling. The weapon was no longer solving a problem. It was becoming one. In his final December entry, he wrote, "Thunder rifle now shapes battlefield behavior more than terrain. Enemy reacts to sound, not sight. Our men react to anticipation, not orders. This is not a rifle. It is an event." As the year closed, the project stood at a crossroads. Either the Thunder rifle would evolve into something safer, or it would disappear entirely. What no one yet realized was that a decision made thousands of miles away would ensure it never had the chance to do either. January 9, 1945, Manila Forward Ordnance Command. The order did not arrive with urgency. It arrived with weight. Typed and signed, routed through 3 different desks before reaching Captain Daniel H. Mercer, it instructed him to suspend further frontline evaluations and report immediately to a temporary ordnance review board operating out of Manila. There was no mention of failure, no accusation of misconduct, no praise. Just a quiet acknowledgement that something unusual had grown too visible to remain ignored. By January of 1945, the Thunder rifle was no longer a rumor confined to jungle skirmishes. Its effects had reached planners, analysts, and men who never heard it fire but understood what it represented. Mercer's briefing room was windowless, concrete, and crowded with people who spoke carefully. Engineers from stateside arsenals, logistics officers, a medical corps representative whose presence alone hinted at deeper concern. On the table lay disassembled components of one of the rifles, laid out like an autopsy. Barrels with stress lines invisible to the untrained eye. Receivers that had absorbed forces they were never designed to endure. Ammunition casings deformed in ways that suggested violence traveling in the wrong direction. The central question was no longer whether the weapon worked. That argument was settled. The question was whether the cost of making it work exceeded the benefit of its existence. Casualty projections were revisited. Field reports were reread with colder eyes. Psychological impact assessments were introduced, something rarely applied to weapons intended for friendly use. The medical officer spoke at length about concussive trauma, delayed symptoms, and the cumulative effect of repeated blast exposure on operators and nearby troops. The conclusion was uncomfortable. Even when the Thunder rifle didn't fail, it still damaged the men who used it. Engineers proposed solutions: heavier barrels, improved recoil dampening, modified stocks, even the idea of a dedicated launcher platform disguised as a rifle to preserve familiarity. Each proposal added weight, complexity, and time. None solved the core issue. The concept itself was pushing an infantry weapon beyond its natural limits. The Thunder rifle wasn't evolving into something safer. It was demanding to become something else entirely. Meanwhile, intelligence officers presented intercepted Japanese communications. The enemy had not only adapted but institutionalized their response. Training materials referenced Thunder-like discharges. Tactical manuals instructed units to bait and eliminate the shooter rather than defend the position. In some cases, Thunder rifle use had triggered counterattacks that caused higher casualties than the bunkers themselves ever would have. The weapon was shaping enemy behavior in a way that was not entirely advantageous. Mercer spoke only once during the session. He didn't argue for or against the rifle. He described what he had seen: men hesitating before firing, the silence after misfires, the way the sound lingered longer in memory than the blast. "It works," he said, "but it changes how everyone behaves, including us." Behind closed doors, another factor loomed. New technologies were arriving faster than anyone could properly integrate them. Improved flamethrowers, more portable demolition charges, specialized bunker-clearing teams trained to operate under fire. And above all, the looming presence of something far more decisive than any rifle: strategic bombing and weapons that promised to end the war outright. In that context, the Thunder rifle began to look less like the future and more like an evolutionary dead end. A decision was made without ceremony.
No formal cancelación.
No public record. The project would be allowed to expire. Existing rifles would be withdrawn quietly as units rotated or resupplied. Ammunition stocks would be inventoried and destroyed. Documentation would be classified and dispersed into unrelated files. The Thunder rifle would not be denied. It would simply be forgotten. Mercer was ordered to oversee the process. Returning to the field one last time, he collected the remaining rifles personally. Some were damaged beyond repair. Others still functioned, scarred but intact. None were surrendered easily. A few soldiers asked if the weapon could be kept, just in case. Mercer said no. He did not explain why. In truth, he wasn't sure himself. Perhaps he feared what would happen if desperation returned and the rifle reappeared. The final destruction of the ammunition was carried out under guard. Each shell was detonated in a controlled pit, one by one. Even then, the sound drew attention. Soldiers stopped what they were doing. Heads turned. The Thunder was unmistakable, even without a rifle behind it. By February, the Thunder rifle was gone from the front. Units advanced without it. Casualties continued, as they always had. Some bunkers required more time, more coordination, more sacrifice. But the battlefield felt quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Mercer submitted his final report on February 21, 1945. It was shorter than expected. The last line read, "Weapon demonstrated possibility, not sustainability." After the war, fragments of the story survived in pieces. A line in a diary, a misfiled report, a Japanese officer's note referring to Thunder without artillery. No intact rifle is known to exist. No photographs have surfaced. The Thunder rifle lives only in the space between documentation and memory. And yet, the idea never truly died. Decades later, when engineers again began asking whether a single soldier could carry the power of a bunker buster, the same constraints appeared: recoil, blast, human limits. The lesson had already been written once, quietly, in the jungles of the Pacific. Some weapons fail because they don't work. Others fail because they work too well, too briefly, and at too great a cost. March 14, 1946, Washington, D.C. The war had been over for months, but Captain Daniel H. Mercer still woke up expecting to hear it. Not the sound of artillery, not gunfire, but that deep, unnatural thunder that never behaved like an echo should. In Washington, the city was alive with victory parades, paperwork, promotions, and quiet panic about what came next. For Mercer, the next assignment was clear and uncomfortable. Make sure the Thunder rifle never officially existed. Post-war cleanup was supposed to be simple. Close files, archive reports.
Réassign personnel.
But the Thunder rifle resisted erasure in the same way it resisted classification. It existed in fragments, in margins, in testimonies that contradicted each other just enough to be dismissed. Mercer was placed under the Office of Technical Intelligence Review, a department whose purpose was not innovation but narrative control. Their task was not to lie, but to prevent a story from forming. The first step was documentation. Reports referencing the weapon were stripped of context and filed under unrelated ordnance tests. Ammunition descriptions were reclassified as failed demolition experiments. Any mention of field deployment was rewritten as limited evaluation under controlled conditions. The language mattered. Words like combat and casualties disappeared. In their place came phrases like environmental stress and operator fatigue. Next came the physical artifacts. 3 rifles had survived intact enough to be transported stateside. Mercer oversaw their disassembly personally. Each component was photographed, measured, and then separated. Barrels were sent to metallurgy labs and later melted down. Receivers were cut and distributed among scrap shipments labeled as surplus. No single location ever held enough pieces to reconstruct the rifle. Even if someone tried, the ammunition was treated with even greater caution. Though most had been destroyed in theater, a small number had been shipped back for analysis. Mercer insisted on their elimination. Not storage, not testing, elimination. The explosions were carried out at a proving ground in Nevada, far from populated areas. Even there, observers noted that the sound carried farther than expected. One technician joked that it sounded like the desert itself had cracked. What Mercer did not control was memory. Veterans talked. Not openly, not in reports, but in late-night conversations, in bars, in letters written and never sent. Stories circulated about a rifle that could knock a man flat just by firing it. About bunkers that collapsed from a single shot. About being targeted the moment the thunder rolled. Most listeners dismissed these stories as exaggeration. War always grows teeth in retelling. But a few details stayed consistent across accounts that should never have intersected. The sound. Always the sound. Japanese veterans carried their own version of the story. During occupation and repatriation, interrogators encountered references to Raimei no Ju again and again. At first, American intelligence assumed it referred to artillery or naval gunfire. But the descriptions didn't fit. No shells falling from the sky.
No prolonged bombardment.
Just thunder from ground level, followed by sudden destruction. Analysts quietly noted the overlap and then filed it away, unsure what to do with a weapon their own records claimed did not exist. As years passed, the Thunder rifle began to mutate. Some versions claimed it fired explosive bullets as standard issue. Others said entire units were equipped with them. A few insisted it was used in Europe. None of that was true, but false details didn't weaken the legend. They protected it. By becoming inconsistent, the story avoided scrutiny. No historian could pin it down without dismissing it entirely. Mercer watched this happen from a distance. He declined interviews. He refused to write memoirs. When asked about experimental weapons, he spoke only in generalities. Once, during a closed-door symposium in 1952, a younger engineer asked him directly whether infantry weapons had ever crossed the line into light artillery. Mercer paused for a long time before answering. "Lines," he said. are only obvious after you cross them. Technologically, the Thunder rifle left fingerprints despite its disappearance. Post-war research into recoilless systems, shoulder-fired explosives, and specialized bunker busters echoed the same problems and solutions. Engineers kept rediscovering the same truth. The human body was the limiting factor. You could build the weapon. You could even make it work. But you could not make it comfortable, safe, or repeatable without changing what it was entirely. By the late 1960s, the Thunder rifle had become something else entirely. A rumor cited in obscure journals. A footnote dismissed by academics. A story whispered by old men who still flinched at sudden loud noises. No museum displayed it. No official history acknowledged it. And yet, every few years, someone would stumble onto a fragment and ask the same question. What if it hadn't been abandoned? Mercer died quietly in 1974. Among his personal effects was a single notebook badly worn, never submitted to archives. On the final page, written in the same pencil as his first entry, was one sentence. "We proved it could be done. We did not prove it should be." That notebook vanished shortly after his death. Today, the Thunder rifle exists only in absence, in gaps between documents, in patterns that don't quite align, in the shared memory of two enemies who both learned to fear the same sound. It stands as a reminder of a moment when necessity pushed innovation past caution, and restraint arrived not from ethics, but from consequence. Because some weapons don't fail in testing. They fail by showing us exactly who we become when they succeed. August 6, 1947, Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. The Thunder rifle was supposed to be gone. Not shelved, not paused, not awaiting funding. Gone. That was the word used in every internal memo that survived long enough to be read twice. And yet, in the controlled silence of Aberdeen's longest test range, a familiar sound rolled across the concrete and dirt, low and concussive, flattening conversation and drawing every head toward the firing line. It was not as violent as it had been in the jungle. It was cleaner, more disciplined, but it was unmistakable. Thunder does not forget itself. What resurrected the project was not nostalgia or curiosity. It was mathematics, post-war analysis of fortified positions, urban combat projections, and the emerging reality of future conflicts painted an uncomfortable picture. Cities would replace jungles. Reinforced concrete would replace earth and timber. Infantry would again be asked to advance against positions that could not be quickly neutralized by air or artillery without unacceptable collateral damage. The same problem wearing a different uniform. This time, the Thunder rifle returned without Captain Daniel H. Mercer. He had refused involvement when quietly approached in late 1946. His refusal was noted, respected, and ignored. A new generation of engineers took over, men who had read the reports without living them. To them, the weapon was not an event. It was a system waiting to be refined. The first change was philosophical. The rifle would no longer pretend to be a standard infantry weapon. The familiar silhouette would remain, but everything else would shift. Weight limits were abandoned. Recoil tolerance was recalculated based on protective gear rather than comfort. The operator was no longer envisioned as a rifleman, but as a specialist. A role, not a replacement. A reinforced platform emerged, borrowing the Garand's basic layout but abandoning its internals. The ammunition grew more sophisticated. Delayed fusing was refined to milliseconds. Explosive yield was adjusted to collapse interiors rather than faces. The goal was no longer dramatic destruction. It was predictable, contained failure of structures. Thunder but controlled. Testing revealed something the original project never had time to understand. When recoil was managed through mass rather than clever engineering, the weapon became survivable. Not pleasant, not safe, but survivable. The sound remained. It always would. But operators recovered faster. Secondary injuries dropped. The rifle stopped breaking itself apart. And that terrified the people watching. Because now the question was no longer whether such a weapon could exist, but whether it should be allowed to persist into doctrine. This version of the Thunder rifle did not look like desperation. It looked like intent. By early 1948, foreign intelligence began to circle. The Soviets asked questions through intermediaries. British observers requested demonstrations. The project's cover thinned. It was rebranded, reclassified, renamed. No longer a rifle, no longer Thunder. Just another experimental infantry support system among dozens competing for attention in a rapidly militarizing world. But some within the ordnance community remembered the old notes, the psychological reports, the way enemy behavior had warped around a single sound. They argued that the weapon's greatest effect was not physical, but anticipatory. It created zones of fear before it ever fired. It trained enemies to react to noise rather than presence. That kind of influence was difficult to predict and impossible to contain. The final test came unexpectedly. During a simulated urban assault exercise, the weapon was used against a reinforced concrete structure meant to replicate a residential block. The shot performed exactly as designed. The interior collapsed inward. The structure failed without excessive debris. On paper, it was a success, but observers noted something else. The opposing force in the exercise halted completely. Units froze. Communication broke down. Not because of casualties, but because everyone had heard the sound and assumed escalation. The exercise ended early, not due to losses, but due to paralysis. That report reached the highest level faster than any technical analysis ever had. The decision that followed was decisive and final. Not cancellation, prohibition. The Thunder rifle in any form would not proceed. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded in ways no one felt comfortable explaining. The project was sealed under classifications that outlived the people who wrote them. Components were destroyed, prototypes dismantled. The second life of the Thunder rifle ended more quietly than the first. Officially, nothing remained. Unofficially, the idea never stopped surfacing. Every decade, someone reinvented it under a different name, a different casing, a different doctrine. Shoulder-fired systems, breaching charges delivered by small arms, controlled explosive penetration. Each time, engineers arrived at the same boundary: human limits, psychological fallout. The sound. Veterans of later conflicts would describe moments that felt familiar without knowing why. A single detonation that stopped an advance. A weapon that changed enemy behavior simply by existing. The Thunder rifle had dissolved into principle rather than hardware. Historians argue about it now when they argue at all. Some insist it was nothing more than a footnote inflated by myth. Others believe it was the missing link between rifles and modern infantry explosives. But among those who study weapon development closely, there is quiet agreement on one point. The Thunder rifle marked the moment infantry weapons crossed from being tools into being signals. Signals of intent. Signals of escalation. Signals that a line had been approached, if not crossed. No surviving photograph proves it existed. No museum displays it. And yet, every time a new weapon promises to give a single soldier the power to erase a fortified position with one pull of a trigger, the same questions resurface. How much force can a human carry? How much sound can a battlefield absorb? And how close are we willing to stand to thunder before it stops being ours to control? Undated, the long echo. Long after the last sealed crate was pushed into a climate-controlled vault and the last operator signed a silence agreement they barely understood, the Thunder rifle continued to exist in a way no document could suppress. It existed as a pattern, as a warning embedded so deeply into weapons development that most engineers never realized where the instinct came from. Whenever a proposal surfaced promising to give a single soldier overwhelming destructive power, someone, somewhere, always hesitated. The hesitation was never written down. It showed up as an extra safety requirement, a delayed test, a request for psychological evaluation that seemed excessive. That was the Thunder rifle speaking without a voice. In the decades that followed, militaries around the world chased the same dream under different names. Urban breaching systems, shoulder-fired demolition tools, directed explosive penetrators. Every one of them flirted with the same boundary. How much violence can be delivered from human scale before the human becomes collateral? Each project rediscovered the same physics and the same biology. Recoil could be redirected but not erased. Blast could be shaped but not silenced. And sound carried authority no armor could absorb. Veterans from conflicts that officially had nothing to do with the Thunder rifle reported familiar sensations. A single detonation that stopped movement across an entire block. Enemy units withdrawing not because they were defeated, but because they believed something worse was coming. Officers writing in after-action reports that morale collapsed without clear cause. The language changed. The phenomenon did not. In intelligence circles, the Thunder rifle became a reference point without a reference. Analysts would compare emerging threats to historical infantry escalation anomalies, a phrase that meant everything and nothing. No one wanted to explain it to junior staff. Some lessons were not meant to be inherited casually. They had to be rediscovered slowly, painfully, so they would be respected. There were moments when the rifle nearly returned. One occurred during a classified counterinsurgency study in the late 1970s, when urban strongpoints once again proved resistant to conventional clearing methods. A proposal circulated briefly, suggesting a limited reactivation of controlled Thunder systems. It died quietly after a single field simulation demonstrated what the old reports already knew. Once the sound was introduced, the situation escalated beyond the planner's ability to manage it. Fear moved faster than command. Another moment came decades later, when advances in materials science promised lighter platforms and smarter blast containment. Younger engineers, unaware of the full history, believed they had solved the problem at last. Their prototype worked beautifully on paper. It failed catastrophically in human terms. Test subjects reported disorientation not measured by instruments, a sensation of being too close to something that should not be that close. The project was shelved. The reason cited was budget. The Thunder rifle never needed to exist physically again. Its influence had already spread. What made it unique was not its lethality. History is full of lethal weapons. What set it apart was intimacy. Artillery kills from distance. Bombs fall from the sky. Missiles announce themselves from far away. The Thunder rifle asked a person to stand inches from an event that behaved like artillery and to survive it repeatedly. That demand changed the relationship between soldier and weapon. It blurred responsibility. It blurred intention. Psychologists who later studied battlefield stress patterns noticed anomalies in units exposed to sudden, localized overpressure events. Reactions resembled those of individuals who had survived natural disasters more than combat. The body did not categorize the experience as a fight, categorized it as survival. That distinction mattered. It affected decision-making, memory, and long-term behavior. In Japanese post-war literature, references to thunder without weather continued to appear. Poets wrote about it without naming it. Soldiers described moments when the earth seemed to strike itself. These accounts were often dismissed as metaphor, but the consistency remained. Thunder from the ground. Thunder that chose targets. Captain Daniel H. Mercer was right to fear what the rifle represented. Not because it was uncontrollable, but because it was honest. It revealed how quickly necessity could justify escalation, how easily innovation could outpace reflection. The Thunder rifle did not seduce its creators with elegance. It confronted them with consequence. Today, modern battlefields are quieter in some ways and louder in others. Precision has replaced brute force. Distance has replaced proximity. And yet, the desire remains. The desire to end resistance instantly. To collapse problems with one decisive act. To make thunder obey. Every generation believes it will be different. That technology will finally make power safe, humane, contained. The Thunder rifle stands as a reminder that some forces resist refinement. They demand respect, not optimization. No archive will ever confirm the full story. No museum will place the rifle behind glass. Its absence is deliberate, because once a weapon becomes a lesson rather than a tool, displaying it risks misunderstanding it. The Thunder rifle was not erased to hide a failure. It was erased to preserve a warning. And that warning still echoes, quietly, every time someone asks how much destruction a single human being should be allowed to carry. Because thunder is never just sound. It is a decision. And once made, it cannot be taken back. Classified retrospective, the weapon that taught armies to listen. There is a point in every long war where technology stops asking what is possible and starts asking what is tolerable. The Thunder rifle was born precisely at that point, and its true legacy can only be understood by following the long, uncomfortable ripple it sent through doctrine, psychology, and the way modern armies think about force. Long after the last experimental unit was dissolved and the last crate was sealed, the idea behind the rifle continued to infect planning rooms like a dormant virus, reactivating whenever conditions resembled those that first gave it life. Urban density, hardened positions, political constraints on heavy bombardment, the need for decisive action without the visible footprint of escalation. Again and again, the same question resurfaced under different labels. Can a single human deliver overwhelming force without turning the battlefield into something uncontrollable? In internal war colleges during the late 1960s and early 1970s, case studies began appearing that did not name the Thunder rifle but described its effects with unsettling precision. Instructors would present anonymized scenarios where a single acoustic-dominant weapon altered enemy behavior before meaningful contact occurred. Students were asked to identify the decisive factor. Most answered incorrectly, citing lethality, penetration, or structural collapse. The correct answer, written quietly on chalkboards after discussion, was anticipation. The Thunder rifle did not win fights by destroying positions. It won moments by convincing everyone nearby that the next moment would be worse. This distinction mattered more than anyone initially realized. Traditional weapons scale violence gradually. Small arms lead to machine guns to artillery, artillery to air support. Each step signals intent and allows reaction. The Thunder rifle collapsed that ladder. It jumped directly to a level of violence normally reserved for crew-served or indirect systems, but delivered it from shoulder height. Once that sound appeared, no one believed escalation could be controlled. Not the enemy, not friendly forces, not civilians. The battlefield reclassified itself instantly. Analysts studying enemy reactions noted a recurring phenomenon they struggled to name. Units exposed to the Thunder rifle or weapons inspired by it often withdrew even when they retained tactical advantage. Fortified positions abandoned intact. Streets cleared without direct contact. The explanation was not fear of death, but fear of unpredictability. Soldiers could not mentally model the threat. It did not behave like a rifle, a grenade, or artillery. It violated categories the brain relies on to assess risk. That violation created paralysis. Attempts to replicate the effect through simulation consistently failed. Sound could not be properly reproduced. Blast could not be ethically simulated at scale. Observers who had never experienced the weapon could not understand why it mattered. This gap led to repeated cycles of reinvention. Each generation believed it had finally solved the human factor through better materials, smarter blast shaping, improved ergonomics. Each generation learned the same lesson under different conditions. Proximity changes everything. One of the most revealing post-war documents came from a joint psychological review conducted decades after the fact, analyzing long-term effects on operators assigned to Thunder-class systems. The report avoided dramatic language, but its conclusions were stark. Operators did not display classic combat trauma patterns. Instead, they exhibited responses associated with survivors of industrial accidents and natural disasters. The weapon had bypassed combat framing entirely. Their bodies remembered the experience as something that should not have been survivable. Repeated exposure did not normalize it. It accumulated. This discovery quietly reshaped training philosophy. Weapons that demanded close proximity to extreme force were no longer treated as simple extensions of infantry capability. They were treated as environmental hazards temporarily harnessed. Rotations shortened. Exposure limits imposed. Silence became part of recovery protocols. The Thunder rifle, even absent, rewrote how armies thought about what a soldier should be asked to endure. Foreign intelligence services drew their own conclusions. In fragmented archives from multiple nations, similar observations appear independently. Acknowledgement that certain sounds carry authority beyond visible damage. Recognition that once such a sound enters a theater, it alters civilian behavior as much as military planning. Some regimes explored exploiting this effect deliberately, not for destruction but for control. Those experiments ended quietly. The unintended consequences proved impossible to predict. In urban studies conducted during the Cold War, planners modeled hypothetical conflicts where thunderclass weapons were introduced early. The results were consistently destabilizing. Infrastructure collapse outpaced physical damage. Emergency services failed not from destruction but from overload. Information networks fragmented under rumor pressure. The sound itself became a weapon independent of intent. Once released, it could not be recalled or limited to its original purpose. This realization led to an unspoken rule that persists today. If a weapon's primary effect is psychological escalation rather than tactical necessity, it will be resisted by institutions even when it appears effective. The Thunder Rifle taught that lesson brutally. Not through ethics, but through consequence. It showed that some advantages are too absolute to integrate safely. Veterans who encountered thunderclass effects on either side of conflict often described the same sensation. A moment where time compressed, where the environment seemed to recoil, where thought lagged behind reaction. These accounts appear across cultures, languages, and decades. The consistency is striking. It suggests the weapon interacted with something fundamental in human perception, something evolution never prepared us to experience intentionally. Modern designers continue to chase the edge without crossing it. They speak of modularity, precision, reduced collateral impact. But buried beneath technical language is a familiar fear that someone will once again build a device that turns proximity into catastrophe and asks a person to stand beside it. When such proposals arise, they often die not from rejection but from delay. Funding shifts. Priorities change. The idea fades without explanation. The Thunder Rifle's ghost does its work quietly. In academic circles, debates persist about whether suppressing such technologies actually prevents harm or merely delays it. Some argue that understanding and controlling thunderclass effects could reduce overall violence by shortening engagements. Others counter that once normalized, such weapons would accelerate escalation beyond political control. The argument has no resolution, only caution. What makes the Thunder Rifle unique in the history of weapons is not its design or its brief service, but the clarity of the lesson it delivered. It demonstrated that the limiting factor in warfare is not metallurgy, chemistry, or engineering. It is the human nervous system. You can build devices that exceed its capacity to contextualize experience. When you do, behavior becomes unpredictable, authority dissolves, and control shifts from planners to panic. No surviving artifact proves the Thunder Rifle existed in its most advanced forms. That absence is intentional. Physical objects invite replication. Lessons invite reflection. The people who buried the rifle understood that difference. They chose to leave a warning instead of a blueprint. Every time thunder rolls across a battlefield without clouds, someone somewhere is standing at the edge of that lesson again, measuring blast radius, calculating yield, asking whether this time will be different. It never is. The Thunder Rifle was not a failure of engineering. It was a success that exposed a boundary. A boundary armies continue to approach carefully, pretending not to see the line drawn decades ago by a sound that carried farther than anyone expected. And that is why the Thunder Rifle still matters. Not because it might return, but because it already answered the question we keep asking.